So we're going to run slightly over into our lunch break. So apologies for this, but let's see if we can make up some time. So the purpose of this session is to follow on from our previous session, thinking about associations. And this session is about how we actually implement them using our sequelized ORM. And there's going to be an additional tool we're going to use, the CLI for sequelize, that will help us automate some of the process of creating models and then changing the state of our database. So if we have a look at probably how you've been doing it so far, you've been using a folder where you create your SQL directly and just like store it in these files, just to make sure you remember like how you're creating your tables, and running them like directly in your Postgres client, you've got your models folder at the moment that is responsible for setting up your connection, and it's quite simple at the moment. And then you've got your model here. Every time you want to add any models or change it to a database, you have to go through a process of adding the right files and folders, and then manually updating your database to make sure it exists in the same, in the right state. And in order to solve some of this problem of managing the state of your database, we're going to use a tool to help us do this. And it's going to help manage our migrations. Remember, a migration is simply a way to describe a change to your database schema. And we understand a schema is all the information needed to represent our current state of our database. So in order to manage our migrations, so that we have a history of the change from scratch, from nothing to the current state, and we can see how it evolves over time, we want to be able to manage this process and get it to be a little bit easier to create and understand. So in order to help with this process, we're going to use a tool, and the tool is sequelize's own command line interface. So in order to do this, we're going to install it, and then we can initialize it. I'll demonstrate this, and then everyone will pair up again and do it in pairs. And we'll go through a process of making sure we set up this new tool so we know how to use it in this new project. And then we'll be able to create models and migrations at the same time. So we'll have a look at what happens when we initialize this tool up here. What happens, what does it give us off the bat? And then how do we use it to manage our database? So we'll have a look at that. After that, after we've done the first part, then it'll be over to you to create the association using sequelize. So we need to use sequelize to describe the associations that we want, and then it will tell the database to update, all right? And create the right foreign keys, the right primary keys, and things like that. So this is going to be what you do in pairs. And then you can extend it again. So this is practice of it, making sure that we know how to implement our associations using sequelize. In order to use sequelize to do this, we're going to use a tool called sequelize-cli to help manage this process for us. So let's dive into it. This is let's actually have a look at, is it still running somewhere? Yeah, it is actually. So currently all your tests will be broken because in this example, there are no models or migrations set up. All right, so you have to do a bit of setup, but all your tests are still written. So you'll know you'll have succeeded in the right setup for your database structure if you can run these tests. So there'll be a test of your completion is if you can run your Cypress tests from this project, and they all pass. And they pass accordingly. It's the world's greatest cat website where you can create cats and then comment on each cat. Each comment is going to be associated with a cat. So we could create a new cat, what's a good name for a cat? Who has a cat? Give me a name for a cat. What's a good cat name?
Tiddles.
Tiddles. Okay. Tiddles is it's not really not a breed, but fine. And Grant, it's yours now. So we have an input field where we can add comments, and they appear below the cat, and so you can comment on different cats. So we've associated each comment with a cat, and they will appear in the right place. So this is what we're trying to get to, an association between each cat and its respective comments. And the relationship here is a one-to-many relationship. Each cat has many comments. Right. So as you can think about this in the same way you'll be doing your bookmarks, and also the challenge this unit, which is our chitter challenge, thinking about the associations in that challenge. This is what we're trying to get to. This will pass once you update the stage of your project. And so your current project, you need to go through and set up. I've essentially removed all of the sequelize stuff, and you have to now add it back in. Getting to the practice of initializing it, creating your models, and running your migrations. So let's do that first part together, this setup, all right? So I'm in the directory, and the first thing I need to do is make sure I've installed all my dependencies. npm install. And then I'm going to initialize the sequelize-cli. I'm going to set it up. So let's have a look at what just happened. It gives me some information about the current environment for the CLI. It's created this file, so let's go have a look at it. Config. So this is some default information about how sequelize-cli is going to connect to your database, and we're going to change this because this is just here by default. It created a models folder with an index.js, much more complicated than the one that we were using. I don't want you to worry too much about this. All right, you can go through and explore this in your own time, but it still does the same thing, which is create the connection to the database, and then loop through your models files to find all your models, and then prepares them. And then it also exports your models and the sequelize. So it still does the same thing, but just a little bit more complicated way. There's a few things we'll look at maybe next week about this file, but at the moment we don't need to worry about it, okay? What else did it do? It created a migrations folder. Let's have a look at the migrations folder. It's currently empty. And created a seeders folder. And the seeders is currently empty. So the one we're going to worry about at the moment are the models and the migrations and this config file. So I've initialized it. Great. Anything that's generated by itself is quite nice to use. It means we have to do less work. But the way that we want to connect to our database is by using environment variables. We don't want to hard code anything in this config file. So we don't want to hard code username, password, database, because we want to store this in version control, and we shouldn't store sensitive data in version control. So we're going to change this config file back to what we were using before slightly, using our environment variables. So making sure that you store those in your .env. All right, so let's grab this and replace this. Line 1 is important. It's making sure we add our environment variables to the environment ready for our export here. And so you have to make sure you update this accordingly. So let's remove this line and rename this to be our .env. Why did you not like that? You already exist. You don't. You do. So why don't you show it to me? That's fun. All right, well, let's just assume you know what you're doing and my editor is not showing me the file. Okay, so I can, I'll just go read that. Bye-bye. Okay, after you've done that, you need to make sure you set up the database, you create it. So you might have access to the create DB command. You might have to log in to put a Postgres client on your command line and then create a database that way. I'm going to create my database so I can access it. And there should be absolutely nothing in here. There's no tables. So let's create our first model and generate a cat model, and it has to be with these attributes because this is what the application is currently expecting. All right, so make sure you follow this carefully, and you can do this in your command line. So you can say I want to generate a model specifically with the name cat, and it's uppercase, so pay attention to that, and then provide attributes with the property name or the attribute name and then the type. They're all going to be string to keep this straightforward for that. So let's go ahead and run this command and see. Oh, I'm not inside my Postgres command. Let's see what happens when I do that. So there are two things that happen when you run your model generate command. You generate a model and you generate a migration. So let's have a look at both. All right. So rather than writing this all by hand, you can write code or use code to do it all for you. So we created a cat.js. This is what happened when we generated it. Again, a little bit more complicated than the way that we were defining it beforehand. But the only thing we need to worry about is making sure that has the right properties here: name, breed, and owner, and they're all string type, which is fine. And this is where we're going to define any associations that we need. All right, but we're going to leave this blank for the moment. So far, so good. Let's have a look at the migration that happened. This file, as you can see, has got a bunch of numbers that correspond to a timestamp. So we break it into parts. You first start off with the year, because this always helps by date ordering. You start with the year, month, day, time to get the best ordering. So 2021, the 6th of August, 10:44 and 54 seconds. And then gives the name of what happened. So this is a create cat. It's what happens when you use a model generate. It gives you the create and the model name cat. So this is the information, and see how it's giving you a few things automatically. It's giving you an ID. Where it identifies this as the primary key. It will auto increment, so it's a serial type, and there shouldn't be any null values. The name, breed, and owner is what we specified, and then it adds these timestamps. So created at timestamp and then updated at timestamp. Created at timestamp always gets configured by the database. As soon as the record gets created, the created at timestamp gets filled in the same way with the updated at. And if you ever were to update it, this would change. So you can always see when the record's been most recently touched. In addition, this migration has an up and a down. So the up is the change, the down is always the inverse. All right, because you want to sometimes be able to move back in time. So you want to know how to undo what you've just done. So for every migration, there's the up and the down. And this is generated for you automatically. And this one's quite simple. There's the create table and then there's a drop table. All right. So let's have a look at now that we've created this model and the migration. Let's update our database. In order to do that, we use the CLI command db migrate accordingly. So if all has happened correctly, if it uses the right authentication data from your config file, so making sure that your config over here is correct, you're making sure that all of these fields are correct. So you have these environment variables in your .env, etc., and they're loaded. Then it will say that it's created your tables. So let's go ahead and look at our Postgres database and see if we were successful. So you can see there are now two tables here. Let's have a look at the first one, the cats table. Select everything from cats. Sometimes it will always downcase. So if you want to make sure it's uppercase, you have to provide strings around it. So your Postgres client will be able to parse it correctly. And you can see here we have the right columns according to our migration. All right, these are the properties, and these are the columns that we have. So we execute our migration. It sent the instruction to the database in some kind of create table command to do the things that we need to do. And if we want to undo it, sometimes it is important to do so. We just provide the CLI with an undo like this. And this goes and runs the down function, the down over here. Sometimes you want to migrate and undo and keep toggling between them. Not advisable, but sometimes you might make a mistake and you want to undo it. All right. And so that's why the up and the down is important, so that you can change the state of your database really quite easily. But let's create it again. All right. Once you run the migration, this is important, never edit this file. All right. Once you run the migration, never edit this file. All right. Because if you edit it, you might introduce some bug that when you want to undo it, it will read this and it will cause some error. So once it's run, consider it to be locked. All right. You run it and don't change it. You can change it before you run it in order to then when you execute it, it will understand what it needs to do, create the necessary SQL, and then send it to the database to execute. But once you run it, don't touch it. Right? Any further change, you add a new migration. Right? Now, while we're playing around, feel free to like revert the migration or do an undo, change the migration, and then redo it. But in general, when we move into our team project, not next week, the week after, once you run migration, you can't go back and edit it. You have to therefore create more migrations if you want to change the state. You want to add more columns, you want to rename a column, you want to do anything extra once you run the migration. That's locked, that's part of history now, and you always add a new migration if you need to make a further change. So be careful, be diligent about managing the state of your database. What was I going to say next? Oh, there was one other table there we should have a look at. So the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted there's another table here called sequelize-meta. So let's have a look at what's in this table. In this table is the history of what migrations have been run. It's how it knows what migrations next to run. So if you add another migration, it won't run all of them, it will only run the one that hasn't yet been done, or the ones that haven't yet been run. So this is the store, this is how sequelize knows where it's at in the list of migrations. You run 4, then you add 3 more, and then you migrate again, it will only do the ones that haven't been done. And then it will store here the ones that have been run. All right. So again, don't change this, don't edit it, unless you have a specific reason to, and usually double check with me just in case. Sometimes things can get out of sync, but double check with me. Otherwise, leave this table alone, but this is how sequelize knows what migrations have been run. It was created automatically on the first migrate. Cool. Let's go back to the instructions. 11:53. When it's back into your pairs, I want you to do everything that I've done so far and then continue with the associations. There's a few more things you have to do to add that association. I want you to generate a model. So you're going to create a second model for the comment with these specific attributes. Again, be careful about this property, making sure it's capitalized like this. And then before you run that migration, I want you to add this into it. All right, you'll have to think about where it needs to be added. You can look at the docs down here to think about the associations, and add this into your migration. Before you run it, this specifies, as we were doing in a diagrams this morning, that we're going to add a reference to the cats table on the ID. All right, we're adding a foreign key, specifically on this column. So cat ID is going to be the foreign key that references the cats table on its ID column. This is how we're adding the foreign key and the primary key association. Then you run the migration, and then you need to add the sort of sequelize helper methods accordingly. So have a look at this, read through the documentation on this below. This is an example. And once you've done this, you should then be able to run your Cypress test to make sure that you are at the right state. Okay, fun times. So I'm going to split up into pairs. You're going to go through this, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. We'll do 45 minutes again, so we'll come back at 12:40 and hopefully be done before 1 o'clock. So you still have a good hour before for your lunch break, right? Okay, before you break into pairs, any questions about what you're going to spend the next 45 minutes doing? Cool. Everyone excited? Absolutely. Lots of sounds of sheer bliss. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.